So I want to talk a little bit about how we envision some of the actors interacting with this backend infrastructure. Want to talk a little bit about some of the visions that we've had for new user registration, both user-driven and system-driven. Talk about what integrating a new application might look like in a model like this, and then kind of looking introspectively at how we actually audit data in this environment. Those are the ones we want to touch on. So an important thing that we think about when we think about this idea of a user having a profile that they can use to interact with the institution, um, a lot of this idea gets into the idea of a user-driven identity management. So if a student's first interaction with the institution is, say, they go to apply.wis.edu or jobs.wis.edu or things like that, and they want to establish a relationship, they want to apply to come to school here, they want to apply for a job here. If their first question is, do you have a profile at UW-Madison? And they're offered the opportunity to either create one or log into an existing one using a credential that they've associated before. It doesn't necessarily imply that they have to have a net ID. It may be a social account or an external account of some kind. If they're able to create that profile as they interact digitally with the institution, then we have that establishment of that relationship being associated with their profile, and we can link that role to their profile. We get away from the idea that they have to give the HR system their social security number and date of birth, and they have to give the student system their social security number and date of birth, so that we can match them up later and recognize them as the same person. This goes a little ways, in addition to being user-friendly, it goes a little ways towards the idea of de-weaponizing some of our identity data that we carry, to be able to say that we've got to collect everything about you to know who you are before we can have any confidence in it. It's the continuity of that interaction that allows us to know that you were the person that we saw before, based on the fact that you logged in and accessed your profile. So this is really around the idea of a user coming to us first and establishing a digital identity. But that's not the only way that people come to us, right? Let's move on to the next one. In this model, sometimes we find out about users or people, I shouldn't always use the term users. Sometimes we find out about people not from the people themselves, but from other places, right? They may be, a data set that we got. We may have gotten something from college boards about somebody that sent their ACT scores here, and we need to start tracking data about them. As the CRM comes more and more into the picture, we may have gotten access to a market data set that includes information about people that we would like to start to have a relationship with. Eventually, at some point, that relationship promotes to the point where we're going to start to interact with somebody digitally. We want them to come, and then we want them to start to access systems. A lot of the vision that we've got around here is invitation driven. So in that case, a relationship being promoted to a digital identity may involve an invitation to the user to come and establish a profile here. Tell us a little bit of information about you, as much as feels appropriate for the relationship that we're trying and the state that we're trying to establish and the stage that we're at that point. But then we've got a point that we can, number one, that we can interact with you digitally, and number two, we have some sense of the roles that are being established in that digital interaction through an invitation process that that allows us to track that, and then we can graduate on to more direct and more intimate types of relationships as are appropriate. We don't have to jump right out of the gun and say, tell us everything about you, in order for you to be able to log into this system that really doesn't feel like it should require that type of data. Sense? Looking at what integrating a new application might look like, this might be a little bit difficult to read, so I'll walk through it. We've got on the top swim lane this idea of a business owner, underneath that an integrator, underneath that this idea of a development portal, which we didn't talk too much about in the architecture diagram, but is an important thing we're trying to work towards. And then identity and access, the identity and access management space. So the first questions that a business owner bringing a new system on might ask are things like, who needs to access this service, and what data do we need to know about them in order to have this service function effectively? So an important thing that we think about with this idea of a role catalog is around picking populations. How do I actually express the roles that need to have access to my service? And a technical integrator, or we've got this idea that we've talked a little bit about around this integration concierge idea, that a person or guided software or some combination of those things can help a non-technical user get to a definition that can actually reduce to data around what are the roles needed to access this service, what data is needed about those roles. If we can express that through, say, a self-service development portal or things like that, to be able to bring that down to an identity and access management definition, we can start to be able to automate access to services based on that. From there, we can start to talk a little bit about what should the life cycle for those services be. When does a user become eligible for that service? How long do they retain eligibility? When should they lose eligibility? And if they lose eligibility, what should that look like? Is there content in a platform that needs to be preserved? Do they need to be given time to be able to assess their content in that platform? Can they just lose access abruptly and immediately? Is there a communication chain that needs to happen around that? Then from there, we can talk a little bit about what identity integration or what integration reporting is needed. How do we monitor the health of that integration? If data feeds that should be there are not there, who finds out about that and how do they find out about that? Finally, from a business process owner, we can talk about how do we report on things like service utilization? How many people actually used that service in the last 30 days? Things like that. Looking at, for example, how to audit access to data in a platform like this, we can start with the idea of auditing a particular data element. We used Campus ID on this. We could think about social number or any other particular data element we were concerned about. If we've gone through the process of defining our enterprise data and our enterprise business objects, the first question really is, what enterprise business objects present that data? We can look from there to be able to understand, which systems consume that data, and then potentially which roles within those systems have access to that data. We can follow those roles to the individuals, and we've got that thread then to be able to answer those audit questions like, for example, who has access to your sensitive data and why? We can also start to fold in things like compliance and attestation to be able to say, if you're in this role, one of the precursors for accessing this data, for example, is that you've done your annual security training, or you've asserted on an annual basis that you still have an ongoing need for access to this data, or things like that, to get us to the idea of managing security by exception rather than managing each individual case. So coming back to the architecture, just to pop it up again, what I'd really like to reinforce is this idea of a flow from individual line of business systems up into defining institutional data, then presenting and institutional events, then presenting that institutional data and events in a relatively normalized, platform-oriented way, then using that to be able to drive identity and access and user-driven identity management. Talking a little bit about sequencing, we as a team we've sat down to say, what are the things that we can start today that don't have any precursors that are absolutely essential to taking the next step? And a lot of that really gets around this idea of enterprise business object definition. What do we really have to do to be able to come up with the idea of an institutional definition for what a student object might look like, or a course object, or a job object, or things like that? From there, starting to figure out what that integration platform, which some of us have referred to as the great hand-waving machine, right? Because once you have a standard interface, you have some ability to be able to abstract what's happening behind that interface, right? Some of our legacy systems can maybe be mated to that in a way that we can set up a longer-term transition, but we can get folks positioned to be able to manage that. As we entertain things like replacing an HR system or replacing a financial system, that might be particularly important to have that abstracted interface where we can change systems on the back end. Getting from there into the idea of EBO-based APIs, and eventually going through and defining roles and having role-based APIs as a way to be able to get the campus community, moving more towards consumption of standard definitions, even if we're pulling those standard definitions from legacy systems that we know might be changing in the next few years. Hopefully being able to help insulate the campus from some of the back end changes as we start going forward. So,
do you want to take questions?
Yeah, that's really what we had for kind of the backstage, the set design, things like that. Why don't we take a few minutes and see if there are questions or thoughts or observations or feedback that folks have got before we start moving on to the front stage.
Jeff? A little bit too early. It might be a little bit too early in the discussion to look through this, but how do you kind of define that we're not punting this down the road? So all the processes that we have now that are painful on the ETL side, how are we not going to move this into enterprise business objects, those types of things? Like, how are we not kicking the can down the road, and kind of what are your thoughts there on how we avoid that?
It's a good question. One of the things that we can't have this platform do is have 25 different definitions of student or 25 different definitions of course, and a lack of guidance for folks in choosing the right thing. We see this, for example, with our enterprise group management system Manifest today, where we've been really, kind of open to the idea of folks defining data as they need to define data, or groups as they need to define groups. And the result of that has been that, folks can use the system tactically, but there's not really a clear guided way of saying, I need to give access to all students, or I need to give access to all employees, or things like that. And that's a piece that's absolutely missing. As we've been working with McKinney Austin and the Office of Data Management, he's really been open to the idea of us working really closely with data stewardship on campus to be able to elevate the definition of those enterprise business objects to be campus-wide definitions. The way that I kind of see this unfolding is using our data custodianship and stewardship processes on campus to arrive at the enterprise definitions of things, while still having a part, for example, the role catalog or the resource catalog that isn't institutionally defined, but is still significant to particular applications, if that makes sense.
Okay. As I was listening to that, I was thinking about all the edge cases and things that come up through the years, particularly with the definition of a student.
Mm-hmm.
And our definition of student may or may not match what CIS representation is.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of use cases that popped into my head that may or may not have been captured, so I'll just say that is a engineering student who is ROTC
mm-hmm.
and be deployed,
yep.
or going to some other advanced training.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're represented as a student on this campus at that point.
Right.
We do some continuity within the College of Engineering, so when they come back, all their homework and everything is gone in that nature.
Yep.
Another use case is I'm a PhD candidate. My PI has said I need to catch up on a bunch of the undergraduate programs, which happen to be on your lecture capture platform. So I need an ID so I can get in there and catch up on those lectures.
Mm-hmm.
I would never push, at this point, Manifest out to the PI to push a net ID through.
Right.
We've kind of Fisher Price mode,
Mm-hmm.
identity access.
Right.
Incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that gets represented very well, and I don't know
Right.
if that transfers to a student actually not being enrolled for a semester, but they give them a semester, and it's basically the PI set of curriculum. The instructor says, yes, I've given them a semester to get this all straight.
Right.
We use those are just sort of examples of, I don't know if that's the way we substantiate that at campus level,
mm-hmm.
or if that's one of those school and college interfaces that teach students flow, or how that all works. Because we all have a little different way of
mm-hmm.
managing that. Doesn't mean it all has to be different. There might be some normalization that gets in there, but there's also a little bit of, the faculty member said, this is how we like
sure.
to work, and we important to make it happen.
That's really good feedback, and I think there's a level of detail that we haven't really talked about around the idea of associating roles with services. One thing that we're trying to go towards as a principle is this idea of an institutional role not being the same thing as a service access policy. So, for example, if I'm a student and this service is configured to require that people be students to access it. There's an institutional temptation to make me look like a student even though I'm not, in order to get me access to that service, which has all sorts of awful side effects, right? That's not a good implementation practice. So having a level of separation between that, to be able to say that service X serves students, and also this other group of people that we've decided don't fit the student mode, but can also access the service. And if we can do that in a way that's delegated to be able to allow people, service owners in particular, to make those decisions as they need to, then I hope we can create the ability to not make you depend on institutional data being a particular way to meet your use case, if that makes sense. David?
What I'm hearing a lot about is data management. And so, I mean, there's been a big push for all of that. So the services are just kind of a layer to get to the data. How are we getting to know where the data is, what the data is? Where is that piece of this?
You'll see a little bit of that in the front stage, but really it ties a little bit back to the integration platform and the definition of enterprise business objects, and then how we envision folks interacting with that through a developer portal, if that makes sense.
Two thoughts. Rob's example of all the different edge cases, I think, explains why we need 25 definitions of student with the actual definition,
right?
So that they can all be understood and used correctly. And they're not edge cases; they're just other modes of student.
Right.
But the other thing you just said worries me. You said the service owner defines which roles or groups have access.
Right.
The problem there is the service owner might just take, in this case, wherever those lecture captured are. But it's actually College of Engineering who has said as a business process, these people need access for it to do their jobs. It's not the service owner exactly, it's something else.
Right, and I think that might be where we kind of loop back to the earlier conversation on service design and make sure that we understand how are we setting the appropriate decision-making processes around how those types of decisions get made.